The night she was turned out of Ashwick Hall began with a sound she had heard before, the particular clap of a door thrown open, not in welcome, but in dismissal. It was past the midnight hour. The candles in the entrance passage had been extinguished at 11, as they always were, and Eleanor Vane stood in darkness at the top of the servants' stair with her one traveling case in her hand and her winter shawl drawn close. She had 7 shillings in her pocket. She had a letter in her bodice. She had, in the language of the county, nothing else to her name. What she had brought to Ashwick Hall 3 years prior was considerable: a thorough education in music and modern languages, a patience for difficult children that never once required raising her voice, and a name that was, if not illustrious, entirely clean. She had given all of it: the teaching, the mending of young minds, the navigation of a household where the mistress's moods turned on the weather, the quiet management of a nursery no one else would enter when the youngest child screamed in the night. She had sat up for 2 nights when the younger of the Montrose boys had a fever, because the housekeeper was afraid and the nursemaid was young, and Lady Montrose did not sit up for things of that nature. She had read aloud from 3 novels and half a history of ancient Rome, and had not left the room until the boy's temperature broke and the color returned to his face. Lady Montrose had said nothing about it. No word of thanks, no acknowledgement. The absence of acknowledgement was not unusual. Eleanor had long since stopped expecting it and had decided, in the privacy of her own reasoning, that the children themselves were sufficient reason to stay. She had given 3 years, and what Ashwick Hall was giving her in return was the cobblestones of a November street and a warning not to return before morning, lest the staff see her departure. Lady Montrose had done it neatly, as she did everything. No raised voice, no visible fury. A cool word delivered to the upper housemaid, who had delivered it to Eleanor with averted eyes and the look of a woman who understood what courtesy demanded. Miss Vane's services would no longer be required. Miss Vane might take her case and her references, with no written reference, and make whatever arrangement suited her. She had until midnight. Eleanor had stood in the room that had been hers, and understood 2 things at once: that the charge against her was without foundation, and that this made no practical difference whatsoever. If you find yourself moved by her standing there in the dark, holding 7 shillings and a letter worn soft from handling, you are precisely where this story means you to be. She walked out of Ashwick Hall with her head level, the cold air striking her face at the door. The stone steps were damp. The street beyond the gate was empty in the way that streets at midnight were empty, a particular stillness that was not peace, but only the absence of witnesses. She had one place to go. She had known it before she reached the bottom stair. The knowledge arrived in the particular way that certain truths arrived. Not as reasoning, but as recognition. The way you understand a sentence before you have finished hearing it. She stood in the lane for a moment with the cold pressing through her shawl and tested other possibilities with the part of her mind that preferred orderly solutions, and found each of them wanting in some specific and practical way, and returned, each time, to the same door. Eleanor had not planned to knock on the door of Whitmore House. She had planned, in the abstract, to reach the coaching inn at the edge of the village, to spend what shillings remained on a night's shelter, and to write, in the morning, to a woman in Bath who had once been a friend of her mother's. This was the sensible plan. She had turned it over in her head during the walk down the servants' lane, and had found it, upon examination, correct in every particular and entirely insufficient. The letter in her bodice was from her father, written in the last weeks of his life, 3 years before. She had read it so many times that she could have recited it in the dark, which was useful, because she was walking in the dark. He had written to her about the debt he was leaving, He had written to her about the title and the entail. He had written, in the careful handwriting of a man who was conserving his energy, about Edward Whitmore, Viscount Ardern, and what he owed their family, and what it would cost Eleanor to claim it. She had not planned to claim it. She had planned to manage without it. She was 24 years old, and it was past midnight, and she had 7 shillings, and she was cold. The door of Whitmore House was answered by a footman who had clearly been asleep. He held a candle in one hand, and his coat in the other, and his expression when he opened the door to a young woman in a gray shawl with a traveling case was not precisely hostile, but it was the expression of a man who had not yet decided what the correct response was. Eleanor said, quite clearly, that she wished to speak with Lord Ardern. She was Miss Eleanor Vane, late of Ashwick Hall. She understood the hour was irregular. She would wait in whatever room was appropriate. The footman looked at her case. He looked at her face. Something in it, and she had been told by people who meant it as a warning that her face was difficult to dismiss, made him stand aside. She waited in a small parlor off the entrance hall. The fire had been banked for the night, but the embers still threw a faint light. She did not sit. She stood by the cold grate and held her case and waited. And what she waited through was the specific silence of a house at midnight that has not yet decided what you are. Edward Whitmore came down in 15 minutes. He was dressed, which told her he had not been sleeping. He wore his coat, but not his cravat, and the absence of it was the only concession to the hour in an otherwise composed appearance. He was taller than she remembered. She had met him exactly once, at her father's deathbed 3 years prior, when she was 21, and too raw with grief to form more than the impression of a dark coat and a stillness that did not feel cold. He stood in the parlor door and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He said her name. Miss Vane. Not in question, but in recognition, which surprised her. She told him what had happened. She told it plainly, without excess, that she had been dismissed without cause and without reference, that it was past midnight, that she had nowhere to go before morning. She did not tell him about the letter. She told him about the debt. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were gray-green in the firelight, and they did not look away from her face, which she noted because she had spent 3 years being looked past by people who had decided she was not worth the energy of direct attention. He said, quite levelly, "Come inside, then." She said that she was inside. There was a pause. Something moved in his expression. Not humor exactly, but the precise thing that existed one step before humor in a man who had not permitted himself the full distance. He said, "Come in out of the cold passage, then. Sit down. There is no fire worth having in this room." He put her in the library. It was warm. He called for tea at an hour, when asking for tea was an act of small authority, and the household complied, and she sat in a chair by the fire in his library at midnight, and felt, for the first time since a housemaid had knocked on her door with her coat in her hands, that she was not in immediate danger. She did not say this. She held her cup and looked at the bookshelves, which were floor to ceiling and in excellent order. She said that she was sorry for the hour. He said he did not sleep well. This was more than she had expected him to say. She looked at him, and he was looking at the fire, and she had the sense of something that had been closed for a long time, that had opened one small inch. She stayed in the library for an hour. He told her that in the morning he would send a message to Lady Montrose. He did not say what the message would contain, and she did not ask. He told her there was a room that could be made ready. He said this in the same level declarative register in which he had said everything else, and she understood, from the particular care he took to be ordinary about it. that he was managing something. She took the room. She put her case on the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark, and held the letter from her father against her sternum, and breathed. What her father's letter had said about him was this: that the Whitmore family had borrowed £3,000 from Thomas Vane 11 years before, under conditions that were not quite a mortgage, and not quite a gift, but something in between. The specific regency arrangement where a gentleman helped another gentleman, and both parties understood that the debt would be honored when honor was possible. Thomas Vane had never called it in. He had died before he could. The £3,000 was not legally owed, nothing having been written down in the form a solicitor would recognize. It was owed in the older and more absolute sense, the sense her father had believed in, which was the sense of a man who understood that what you did when you had the means and someone needed help was help them. She had not come to Whitmore House to collect £3,000. She had come because it was midnight and she was cold, and it was the only door in the county she had not been told to use the servants' entrance of, and she had used the front door, and he had let her in. She was still surprised by that. Eleanor was not what Lady Montrose's drawing room had decided she was, which was a young woman of good manners and limited means who could be relied upon to be grateful and to remain invisible. This was the season's considered verdict, delivered in the manner of seasons, through a series of small social exclusions so smoothly executed that they barely announced themselves as exclusions at all. She was not invited to the assembly rooms at Bradwick. She was not introduced at the Pemberton dinner. When Lady Montrose held an evening for the local families in November, Eleanor had sat with the children upstairs. The county had called her in 3 separate registers of dismissal, something that reduced her to the sum of her circumstances. Miss Vane was very pleasant, of course. Miss Vane was quite accomplished. Miss Vane was only a governess in the season's accounting, and governesses, however pleasant, did not constitute eligible company. Not at the assembly rooms, and not at the Pemberton dinner, and not in the drawing rooms where the season's business was properly conducted. Eleanor had understood this and had proceeded anyway, which was what she did. She had taught the Montrose children. She had played the pianoforte when asked and stopped when not asked. She had made herself useful in a dozen ways that a useful woman could make herself useful. And she had done it without complaint and without visible resentment, because complaint and visible resentment were not tools available to a woman in her position, and because, beyond the practical, she had a genuine fondness for the children. The charge that Lady Montrose had leveled against her, that she had conducted herself with unseemly familiarity with a young gentleman who had visited in October, was not true. Eleanor knew exactly what had happened in October. The young gentleman had been rude to the eldest child at supper, and Eleanor had told him so, clearly and without apology, in front of 2 footmen and the child in question. He had gone to Lady Montrose the following morning. It had taken Lady Montrose 6 weeks to act on it. This meant she had not acted in anger, but in calculation, which was worse, in a certain sense. Lord Ardern sent his message to Lady Montrose in the morning. Eleanor did not know what it said until the afternoon, when he told her, in the same quiet way he told her things, that Lady Montrose had furnished a written reference, which would be delivered by the day's end. He said it as though it were a minor logistical matter. She looked at his face, which gave her nothing. She said, "How?" He said, "I asked her to." She waited. He was quiet in the way that was not unhelpful, but was simply the natural shape of his silences, the way a man is quiet when he has said what he means, and sees no reason to extend it. She said, and she agreed. He said, she was persuaded to agree. "Sit down." She sat, not because she was told to, but because her legs had decided to cooperate with the instruction on their own terms. She was discovering that he had this effect intermittently, in that some part of her body would respond to what he said before she had processed it through the cooler machinery of decision. He brought her a letter of reference that afternoon. It was written on Lady Montrose's personal stationery and signed with Lady Montrose's full name, and was, in every particular of its language, the opposite of the reference Eleanor would have written for herself, and it was excessive. 3 paragraphs of praise for a woman Lady Montrose had turned out at midnight without a word. Eleanor read it twice. She looked up. He was standing by the window with his coat to her, looking out at the drive. There was a portrait on the far wall. A woman, painted some 15 years prior, with the same gray-green eyes. She asked, without intending to, who the portrait was. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My wife. She died 4 years ago." Eleanor said she was sorry. He said she liked music. She was fond of the pianoforte. There was a particular quality to the way he said it. The past tense held carefully in the mouth. The very specific name detail deployed instead of the larger thing the detail contained, and Eleanor understood without needing to understand it further. She had sat with her father for 3 weeks. She knew what it looked like when a person had learned to carry something very heavy and had decided not to put it down because putting it down would require knowing what to do with their hands. She did not say anything else about the portrait. She folded the reference and held it. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the particular quality of his attention that she had been cataloging without intending to, the way it settled on her rather than passing over her. He said, "Do you intend to leave today?" She said she did not know where she would go today. He said, "Then stay another day." She stayed another day. She stayed a week. It was not decided formally at any point. He had not made the offer in language she could have refused, and she had not refused it. And they had moved from one morning to the next in a way that resembled an arrangement without either of them having used the word. She read in the library. She walked the gardens in the mornings when the cold was not absolute. And she had learned the geography of the grounds without intending to. The way you learn a place when you are occupying it rather than visiting. The walled kitchen garden to the east, the gravel walk along the south face of the house, the gate in the stone wall that looked onto a field of bare winter grass, and beyond it, the gray line of the hills. She played the pianoforte once, on an afternoon when she thought the house was empty, and discovered when she stopped that he had been standing in the doorway for the last 10 minutes. She had been playing from memory, an Italian air that her mother had taught her when she was 9, one of the pieces that lived in her fingers rather than her mind, the kind that returned without invitation on quiet afternoons. When she became aware of him, she let the last note resolve and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He said that she played very well. She said that she had had a great deal of time to practice. He said, yes. He did not move from the doorway. She sat with her hands still on the keys and was aware of every particular of the distance between them, which was perhaps 8 feet, and felt in the quiet of the room both very great and very small. The county began to speak about it. This was inevitable. Whitmore House was not invisible, and Lord Ardern was not a man whose household could be visited by a young woman of no particular consequence without the machinery of local opinion turning over the event and producing, in the space of 10 days, a verdict. The verdict was offered to Eleanor by the housekeeper, who delivered it with the particular combination of genuine concern and social information that a kind woman would consider a warning, that the neighborhood was saying that Miss Vane had attached herself to Lord Ardern in a manner that was not quite proper, given the disparity in their stations and the irregular nature of her presence in his house. Eleanor thanked her. She sat in the library after the housekeeper left and looked at the fire, and felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest. The sensation of being reduced to a single, convenient misreading, flattened into a shape the season could label, and place somewhere that did not require further attention. A governess angling for her employer. This was what they had decided she was. She was not angry. She had lived long enough in the machinery to understand that the machinery was not personal. It simply required a category for everything. And she was an irregular element. And the category they had chosen was the one available. She was, however, tired. She thought about the letter in her bodice. She thought about £3,000 and what it might purchase in practical terms. Not a life of luxury, but a life of choice, which was a different thing and a more valuable one. A small house somewhere. The ability to decline a position. The ability to sit at the front of a coach rather than the back and arrive somewhere not exhausted before she began. She had not come to Whitmore House for £3,000. She was beginning to understand, however, that the debt was not purely financial, that the thing her father had understood when he had helped the Whitmore family was not only a transfer of money, but a transfer of the kind of security that allowed a person to act from their values rather than from desperation. She had been trying to build that security from the inside of service positions for 3 years, and what had happened at midnight at Ashwick Hall was a demonstration of how thoroughly that strategy could fail. She was sitting with this thought when Lord Ardern came into the library. He said, "I have had a letter from Lady Ashworth." She knew the name. Viscountess Ashworth was the social authority of the county in the way that certain women become social authority, not by being universally liked, but by being universally acknowledged, which was a different and more durable thing. Her opinion on any subject was the opinion the neighborhood eventually arrived at, sometimes immediately and sometimes after a period of circling. Eleanor said, "I see." He said, "She has invited us to the Ashworth dinner on Thursday." Eleanor waited. She was looking at the fire. She said, "Us." He said, "You and I." She turned then. He was standing by the desk with the letter in his hand, and his expression was the controlled thing it was. But there was something along his jaw that she had learned to read as the surface tension of an emotion that was not yet permitted to arrive. She said, "That is an unusual invitation," he said. "It is," she said. "May I know what you wrote in return?" He said, "I accept it." There was a silence. She was not a woman who used silences strategically. She had too much respect for accuracy for that. But she found that silence was the only accurate response to what he had just said, so she let it stand. He said, "I should have spoken to you before I answered." "I recognize that." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am speaking to you now." She looked at him. He looked back at her. He looked. The portrait of his wife was behind him on the far wall, and the light was going, and the fire had settled. And what was present in the room was something that did not have a name in the vocabulary either of them had been using for the past week, which was the vocabulary of sensible practical arrangement. She said, "What are you doing, Lord Ardern?" He said after a moment, "I am not certain. I would like your permission to continue doing it." She had not expected that. She said, "That is not a very precise answer." He said, "No, it is not." She said, "And if I said no?" He said, "Then I would not continue. And I would take you to London in the morning, at my expense, and write to the woman in Bath you mentioned, and ensure you had the means to manage until she answered." Eleanor looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap in the composed way she had learned to fold them. The way that said nothing was wrong when everything was difficult. She looked at them and thought about the piano in the afternoon, and the way he had stood in the doorway and said nothing until she had finished. She thought about the tea at midnight, the letter of reference that said everything Lady Montrose had never once believed. She said, "I do not know what you are asking me," he said. "I am not asking you anything yet. I am only asking if you will allow me to ask." She told him she would allow it. Thursday was a clear evening, cold and still, with the last light turning the stone facade of Ashworth House the color of old gold. Eleanor wore her best gown, which was the cream muslin with the green ribbon, and she was aware that it was insufficient for an Ashworth dinner in precisely the way that her presence would be considered by some to be insufficient for an Ashworth dinner. And she wore it without apology, because she had no other, and because she had decided, in the carriage, that she was not going to begin this evening by apologizing for what she had. She had dressed without a maid, as she had been dressing herself since she entered service. She had pinned her hair at the glass in the room that was hers, and had looked at her own face for a moment. The face the season had decided was not worth the effort of proper attention, and had found it unchanged. She had the look, she had been told once by a woman who meant it as a compliment, of a person who has thought something through. She had accepted the compliment without knowing quite what to do with it, and she looked at her reflection now with the same uncertainty, and put on her gloves, and went down. He had looked at her when she came down, the particular look she had catalogued and not yet named, and said nothing at all. He had handed her into the carriage and sat across from her, and the carriage had moved through the dark, and he had asked her about the book she had been reading, and they had talked about it for the length of the journey, and it was the most ordinary thing she had done in 3 weeks, which meant it was also, in its ordinariness, the more notable. Lady Ashworth's dinner table seated 26. Eleanor was placed at the middle of it, which was not the governess's position at a table, and not the position of a woman of no significance. She understood what it meant, and she sat in it, and she was still. The neighbor to her left was a Mrs. Fenwick, who introduced herself with the bright attentiveness of a woman who had come to dinner specifically to obtain information. She said that it was so kind of Lord Ardern to bring Miss Vane out. She said that it was unusual, of course, for a gentleman to bring a young woman who was not, as yet, family, but that perhaps things were different in London. She smiled when she said this, which was the social equivalent of applying pressure to a bruise and watching the face. Eleanor said, "I have not been in London recently, so I could not say." Mrs. Fenwick said, "And are you and Lord Ardern long acquainted?" Eleanor said, "My father was a friend of his family. The acquaintance is of some years' standing, though we have spent little time in company until recently." Mrs. Fenwick said, "Yes, we had heard that you were staying at Whitmore House, a woman in your position, quite alone. It must be a relief to have such a benefactor." The word benefactor was placed with the specific care of a woman who had decided on a word and was watching to see where it landed. Eleanor felt it land. She said, quite pleasantly, "It is pleasant to be among people who understand an old family connection. Will you have more soup, Mrs. Fenwick?" Across the table, she was aware of Lord Ardern's attention without looking at him. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Mrs. Fenwick and her soup, and the particular business of being unremarkable in a room full of people who had come to decide what she was. The table decided several things over the course of the evening. She observed it the way she observed most social processes, from the interior of a composure that had cost her some effort to maintain over 24 years. She was pleasant to be near, they conceded. She was well-spoken. She handled the fish course without incident. Lord Ardern spoke to her twice at the table, and both times in the level declarative way he spoke to everyone, which gave them nothing to work with, which she suspected was deliberate. After dinner, Lady Ashworth drew Eleanor into a small sitting room with the quiet authority of a woman conducting a private proceeding. She was a neat woman in her late 40s, with a particular directness of gaze that Eleanor found, in contrast to Mrs. Fenwick's brightness, genuinely comfortable. Lady Ashworth said, "You are Thomas Vane's daughter." Eleanor said she was. Lady Ashworth said, "I knew your father. He was a good man and a generous one. I understand there was no provision made." Eleanor said that the estate had been entailed. Lady Ashworth looked at her for a moment. She said, "Lord Ardern is not a man given to gestures. You understand that." Eleanor said she was beginning to. Lady Ashworth said, "What he does, he means. I thought you ought to know." She was returned to the drawing room. Lord Ardern was standing near the window, with the specific stillness she had learned to identify as his body, waiting for something it was not yet sure it could have. She did not go directly to him. She stood with a cup she did not drink from, and let the room move around her, and thought about what Lady Ashworth had said. What happened next was simple, in the way that consequential things are sometimes simple in their structure, whatever their weight. Mrs. Fenwick, emboldened by 2 glasses of wine and the particular confidence that comes from believing the room agrees with you, said something in the small cluster near the fire. Eleanor did not hear all of it. She heard the end of it. That it was one thing to visit Whitmore House once, as any old connection might, and quite another to take up residence there, and that certain standards must be maintained if the neighborhood were to remain what it was. The room heard it. Eleanor heard it. Lord Ardern, across the room, heard it. He set down his glass. He crossed the room in 4 strides. There was nothing hurried in it. It was the particular movement of a man who had made a decision and was executing it without revision. The way a person crosses a room when they have been holding a question in their hands for some time and have at last decided what the answer is, and that the answer requires action rather than further deliberation. The cluster near the fire went quiet at the approach. Lady Ashworth did not move, but her eyes tracked him. Mrs. Fenwick's fan stilled. He stopped beside Eleanor. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him through the thin muslin of her sleeve. He looked at the cluster near the fire, and specifically at Mrs. Fenwick with the particular quality of attention that stripped a social surface to its structure and left no room for the comfortable interpretation that a more tactful man's expression would have allowed. He said, "Miss Vane is my intended wife. The room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that a drawing room produces when 23 people have all elected to breathe shallowly at the same moment." Mrs. Fenwick's mouth opened and did not close immediately. Lady Ashworth, from her chair, did not move. But something in her eyes shifted with the look of a woman who had said what she'd said in the sitting room for exactly this reason, and had not been surprised. Lord Ardern turned to Eleanor. His face was entirely composed. His eyes were the gray-green she had catalogued every day for 10 days and had not yet found a name for. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I said I would ask when I was ready. I am aware this is earlier than I indicated." She looked at him. She looked at the room, which was waiting in the suspended way of rooms when something has shifted the weight of the social air, and everyone present knows it, and no one is yet certain what comes next. She said, also quietly, "You might have consulted me first." He said, "Yes. That was not well done." She said, "No." He said, "Miss Vane." She said, "Eleanor." He said her name. He said it in the room. He said it in the particular register of a man who had said a name like that once before, in a different life, and had not permitted himself to say it since. She held that for a moment, The room waited. She said, "Yes, I will." The drive home was quiet. The horses moved through the dark at an easy pace, and the carriage lamps threw their small, warm light, and Eleanor sat across from him with her hands in her lap and felt the specific unreality of an evening that had produced 3 consequential events before the clock struck 10. He said, "I should have spoken to you first." She said, "You should have." He said, "I will do better." She said, "That is a very short promise." He said, "I am not given to speeches." "I believe you knew that." She looked at him. He was looking out the window. She could see the line of his profile against the dark glass, the jaw she had spent 10 days learning to read in candlelight, and what she felt was not the heat of a ballroom scene, but the quieter and more durable thing underneath it, the thing that had been building since midnight, and a cold parlor and a cup of tea pressed into her hands by a man who did not sleep well. She said, "There is a letter." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew about the debt." He said, "I knew about it when I was 20, and my father told me what your father had done. I have known about it since. I should have acted sooner. I did not know what action was possible until you knocked on the door." She heard the weight in that. Her father had lent the money in the year that Eleanor was 13, when the Whitmore estate was in difficulty, and Thomas Vane had had the means to help, and had helped quietly and without condition, and had not spoken of it to anyone, including Eleanor, for years. She had found out from the letter, written in the last weeks when he was preparing for the possibility that he would not recover. He had written it carefully, as a man writes things he hopes will not be needed, but knows, maybe. He had written, "You are owed nothing legally, and you should not feel obligated to ask, but if you ever find yourself at a point where you need it, you should know that it exists." This was the entirety of his instruction. He had not told her what to do. He had told her what was true, and left the decision to her. Eleanor looked at her hands. She thought about 7 shillings and the cold step and the door that had opened. She said, "You do not owe me a wife's position for £3,000, he said. "No, that is not what I am offering." She waited. He said, "I am offering it because I have spent 10 days watching you read and play and tell the truth, and I have not been interested in anything in 4 years. That is what I am offering it for." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the stone walls of the lane passed in the lamplight, pale and cold and real. She said, "That is more precise." He said, "I thought it might be." She looked at him. He looked back. In the small space of the carriage, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, she let herself feel, without qualification, what it was to have been seen. Not assessed. Not reduced to a category and placed somewhere convenient. Seen specifically by the one person in the room who had the peculiar and rare quality of accurate attention. What she did not do was weep, because she was not that kind of woman. What she did was let the thing settle. By Christmas, the fire in the Whitmore House library had become hers in the particular way that fires become yours when you have sat beside them long enough to know how they smell when the wood is dry versus damp, and which side of the room they heat first. The children from the Ashwick Hall nursery had been removed from Lady Montrose's care by a cousin who had long suspected what Eleanor now knew was true, and the eldest had been brought to Eleanor, briefly, to say goodbye to their teacher. And the child had pressed a small watercolor into her hands, a painting of the library in the child's careful amateur style, the books and the firelight and 2 figures in chairs. Eleanor had put the painting on the mantelpiece. She had put the letter from her father in the drawer of the writing desk with the worn seal facing up, where she could see the crest when she opened it. not hidden, not displayed, simply present. He came in from the cold on a January afternoon with frost still in his hair, and stopped in the door of the library with the particular look he had when he was watching her, and did not know whether she had seen him. She had. She had been watching him from the moment she heard the door, and what she felt in the moment before she looked up and met his eyes was the specific warmth of a life that had found its shape, not through accident, but through a midnight walk down a dark lane to the one door in the county that had opened. He sat down. He said nothing for a moment. He took the book she had been reading and turned it to see the spine and put it back. She said, "Well." He said, "Well." She said, "Do you intend to say anything else?" He said, "There is not much else to say. You are here. That is sufficient." Eleanor looked at the fire. The painting was on the mantelpiece. The letter was in the drawer. The room was warm, and the frost was on the outside of the glass, and the thing that had begun at midnight on a cold step with 7 shillings in a pocket had arrived here, to this room, to this fire, to the particular and reliable quiet of being known by one person who had decided that knowing her was worth the cost. She said, "I find that it is. If this story moved you, share it with someone who deserves to be reminded that the right door does exist. Stay until the end, always." She did not look up. The fire held. The frost did not enter. Outside, the bare trees of the Whitmore grounds stood in the January stillness, and inside the library, 2 people who had both learned the particular loneliness of carrying something heavy in silence sat together in the warm and did not need to say anything else at all.